Hi, and welcome to another video on macroeconomics. Today on this lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about savings, investment, and the relationship between the trade balance and savings and investment and capital flows in an economy. So we're going to start going back a little bit to our definitions that we look at in our chapter about GDP, about national income accounting, and we're going to define a few terms that are related to savings and investment in the economy as a whole. So we're going to start with the notion of national saving. National saving essentially is how much is an economy saving as a whole, and it's simply defined what is the current income of the economy minus current spending needs. So we go back to our formulas. If you remember, total income in an economy, GDP, Y, is equal to spending, total spending, which we divide in categories depending on who's doing the spending. Private spending, capital C, consumption. Firms doing spending, we call it investment. Government doing investment, we call it G for government spending. And then we have spending done by foreigners in our good net of what we buy from foreigners, and that's net exports. That will be the net purchases from foreigners of goods. And so the right-hand side of that equation represents total spending in the economy. The left-hand side represents the total income, but the right-hand side includes net spending by foreigners. And so if we want to, for now, focus on a closed economy, let's forget about what foreigners are doing. Let's say the economy only is, there's no international trade. And so in that case, we define national savings simply as the difference between total income Y and the spending done by private households and the government. Why? Because the spending done by firm is of a different nature. It's spending that is done towards investment, that is to say, towards increasing the productive capacity of the economy in the future. And so it just follows from that simple equation that in a closed economy, the total investment done by firms is equal to national savings. That's, essentially an identity. Is always true by the way we define national savings. It's essentially saying the part of income that private household and the government are not spending is being used by firms to increase their productive capacity in the form of investment. Now, because we have spending broken down in categories as private spending, capital C, and government spending, capital G, we can divide up savings into two terms. One is the saving done by households, we call private savings. And so the private saving essentially is the income, total income Y, net of taxes, because private household, there's a transfer that takes place. Taxes essentially are a transfer that goes from private household to the government. So after household receive their income, they give that transfer of taxes to the government. Whatever they're left with is called the after-tax income, then, or sometimes it's referred to as disposable income. So disposable income is the income disposable for spending minus the actual spending. The difference is what they're saving. And that's private savings. And then from the point of view of the government, taxes are transfer receiving from the private sector is the income of the government. And then the government is spending G. The difference between the tax revenues T and the spending G is the saving, or sometimes referred to as the government budget surplus. If most of the time governments spend more than what they make in tax revenues, then the term G would be bigger than the term T, in which case we say the government is running a budget deficit, and in that case, public savings would be negative. What does it mean that you have negative savings? It means that you're spending more than your income, and so you must be borrowing the difference. So negative savings means you're borrowing instead of saving, okay? And obviously it just follows from the formula that if you add private saving by public saving, the taxes will cancel out because they're simply a transfer within the economy from the private sector to the government, and they cancel out, and you're left with Y minus C minus G total saving, okay? So taxes include things like taxes paid, also include things like transfers in the form of, for example, social security payments to retirees. There's also interest that the government pays on the bonds, on the debt that it has, and things like that. But We don't have to concern ourselves too much with those details at the moment. We'll just call all of that capital T, okay? And so, as we said a moment ago, total national savings is just the sum of private and public savings. That simply follows from adding things up and noticing that the taxes will cancel out because they're simply a transfer. We can use this decomposition and just put everything together. So we had for a closed economy, national savings equal investment. Then we said we can divide national saving into private and public savings. So if we combine both of those things, we have private savings plus public saving equal investment. Or just to keep in mind that governments typically are running a budget deficit, they're spending more than what they collect in taxes, we will have minus public savings called government budget deficit. And so we can come up with the following equation that says private savings in an economy, the saving by the private sector, is financing two things. It's financing private investment by firms, and it's financing the budget deficit by the government. Okay, so in other words, if the government is spending more than what is collecting in taxes, it must be that it's borrowing that from the private sector. Why? Because it's a closed economy. When you have an open economy, then you could be borrowing from abroad. Okay, but for a closed economy, this is the basic formula that we find when we think about these basic definitions. Okay. Now let's think about the case of the open economy. In an open economy, we have one additional source of funds, which is now one, we're going to be trading with foreigners. So we're going to be buying goods from foreigners, and foreigners are going to be buying goods produced domestically. And there's also going to be flows of capital, that is to say financial assets, dollars, think of it as, or stocks or whatever financial asset you want, going in and out of the economy. And so the net capital inflow we define as the capital flow of funds entering an economy minus whatever we're investing outside. So that means if the net capital inflow is positive, it means that on the net, foreigners are investing in our economy. Okay. So an example of net capital inflow from the point of view of the U.S. economy is if a Canadian citizen buys a U.S. stock in the New York Stock Exchange. Let's say you buy a Tesla stock. Nowadays, Tesla stocks are not so popular, but whatever stock. That's an example of capital going out of Canada into the U.S. to finance U.S. corporations. So in an open economy, the net capital inflow is going to finance investment in excess to whatever national savings of the economy are not saving. And that's what gives us the first equation. We can calculate how much money is coming into the economy by foreigners to seeing how much are firms investing, what is the funds available domestically, what is national savings. The difference between those two has to be how much capital is coming from abroad. So net capital inflow has to be equal to investment minus national savings. Now, going back to our basic national income accounting formula for an open economy now, we have that total income Y is going to have consumption, investment, and government spending, the same terms as in the closed economy, but now we have one extra term, which is the net purchases of foreigners, the trade surplus, in other words. Remember, NX stands for net exports, is exports minus imports. And so rearranging terms a little, moving the C and the G to the left-hand side, we get that national savings equals investment plus the trade surplus, and combining equation 1 with equation 3 and rearranging a little, we have that the net capital inflow in the economy is equal to the trade deficit. So this gives us a somewhat surprising relationship. It just follows, this is an identity, it just follows from our definitions, but it allows us to understand the following fact. If an economy is having a trade deficit, then it must be having a net capital inflow, which is to say the economy must be borrowing funds from abroad. And an example of this is the relationship between the United States and China, and this is, is at the core of all of this debate about tariff that has been going on, which is the U.S. have been sustaining trade deficit with China. In other words, the U.S. is buying goods from China in value more than what is selling to China, so there's an imbalance there. And what happened with that imbalance? Well, it must be that China is lending the difference to the U.S. And if you borrow from China 1 year, nothing happens. But if you keep borrowing year after year after year after year, essentially that starts to pile up in debt. And that's the reason behind this sustained trade deficits that the US have been having with China, is that the Chinese central bank now has accumulated a very large amount of debt from the US government. In other words, the US government now owes a lot of money to the Chinese government as a result of this. Okay, so this is kind of like a little bit of a surprising element if you think about it. Why is that going on? Well, to think a bit about the intuition behind this relationship, if the US is buying goods and services that are worth more from China when China is selling to the US, that means China ends up with a bunch of dollars because the US is paying for those imports from China with dollars. And so what is China going to do with all that money? Well, China decided they're going to buy bonds from the US government. That is to say, pieces of paper that says the US government owes money. In other words, it's going to lend that money back to the US government. So that's essentially things that have been going on. Now, this become a significant factor in the emergence of Trump and in the trade war and all of this. It's about this, you will hear Trump talk about we've had a trade deficit with Canada, we have a trade deficit with China, that's unfair. That's what's behind this, is that you can't sustain this trade deficit over long periods of time because that means you're borrowing and then eventually you have to pay back. Nowadays, the US economy pays in interest, the US government pays in interest on its bonds to China more than all of its defense budget combined. So that's a mind-blowing fact right there for you to go check. So rearranging a little bit allows us to come up with an equation. If you come back here to this equation, you will see there's essentially three terms. One is the government deficit, and the government deficit can be financed now either by private savings being higher than investment or by net capital inflows. And so the difference between private savings and domestic investment sometimes is called the private balance. And so, for example, if you look for the US, the private balance, the green line, would be private savings minus investment in the US. So when that's positive, that means some of the investment in the US is financed by private savings. Then what you have at the bottom negative is the government deficit. So that government deficit, look at 2008, big deficit, has to be financed by the blue line is the trade deficit. So that's essentially sometimes referred to as the twin deficit. You see the US for a lot of this time period here, perhaps with the exception of a few years during Clinton presidency where it had a brief government surplus, and in the early 2000s also it had government deficit and it also has a trade deficit. That's referred to as twin deficit. What does that mean? It means when the government has a budget deficit, it can borrow that from private savings in excess of investment, or it can borrow that from foreigners. And the twin deficit, which started in the 1980s in the US, essentially says you borrow from foreigners. And so if the government is running a budget deficit, the most likely counterpart to that is that you're going to start observing a trade deficit also, which means you're borrowing that money from a foreign country. And like I said, when that accumulates over long periods of time, it can create problems because then countries start worrying about when are they going to pay me back. Think of it as if you see your friend that owes you money going out every night, and every day when he has to pay you, he comes back and tells you, I want to borrow some more. Eventually, you're just going to say, hey, hold on. First, you pay me back, and then we keep talking. All right? So that's a little bit of a basic introduction of some of the ideas about trade and capital flows and savings and investment. So thanks for watching.